The ancient city of Mistravale was known for two things: its cobblestone streets that twisted like the lyrics of a forgotten song, and the haunting music that drifted from the shadow alley each night. No one knew who played the violin under the cloak of darkness, but the melody was unforgettably bittersweet, a tune that seemed to draw the heart closer to something unspoken. For Layla Marquet, a poet and dreamer, the music was her only solace. She had come to Mistravale seeking inspiration after years of writer's block, leaving behind the bustling life of her hometown. Yet inspiration had eluded her until the first night she heard the haunting melody. The sound was faint at first, carried on the wind that swept through her open window. She closed her eyes and leaned against the sill, her heart catching on every note. Whoever the musician was, they played as though they were pouring their soul into the bow. It wasn't perfect. It was raw, sharp in places, as though the violin itself were weeping. The next evening, Layla couldn't resist. She wrapped herself in a shawl and followed the sound through the winding streets. It led her to Shadow Alley, a narrow passageway where the lamplight barely reached. There, under the arch of an old stone bridge, stood a man with a violin. He was tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his face as he played. His eyes were closed, his brow furrowed, as though the music was a burden he carried alone. Layla stayed hidden in the shadows, afraid to interrupt. When the last note faded into the night, the man opened his eyes and turned, as if sensing her presence. "You're not the first to follow the music," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Layla stepped forward hesitantly. "It's beautiful," she said. "Who are you?" The man gave a humorless smile. "A ghost of this city." He inclined his head. "And you?" "Layla, a poet." He arched an eyebrow. "A poet chasing shadows? How fitting." She frowned, her curiosity piqued. "What's your name?" "Call me Ash," he said before turning away and vanishing into the darkness. Chapter 2: The Violinist and the Poet. Layla returned to the alley the next night and the night after that. Each time she listened to Ash play, captivated by the pain and passion in his music. Slowly, their encounters grew longer. He would pause between songs to speak with her, his words as enigmatic as the man himself. "What do you write about?" he asked one evening, his violin cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. "Everything," Layla replied. "Or at least I used to. Now it feels like the words won't come." Ash studied her, his gaze intense. "Maybe you're looking in the wrong places. Inspiration isn't found in the light, it's forged in the shadows." "And what are your shadows?" she countered. His expression darkened. "Too many to name." Layla wanted to press him, but she sensed his pain ran deeper than he let on. Instead, she shared bits of her own story. Her struggles with self-doubt, her fear that her best work was behind her. "Words are your music," Ash said one night, "and like music, they're not meant to be perfect, they're meant to be honest." His words stayed with her, and over the next few weeks, she began to write again. The poems that flowed from her pen were raw and unpolished, but they were hers. She started leaving them for Ash in the alley, tucking them into the violin case he left open at the end of each performance. He never commented on them, but Layla noticed a subtle change in his playing, an emotion she couldn't quite name but felt deeply. Chapter 3: A Broken String. One stormy night, the music didn't come. Layla waited in the alley for hours, her shawl soaked through, but Ash never appeared. The next morning, she asked around the city, but no one knew much about the mysterious violinist. "He's been here forever," one shopkeeper said. "Some say he's cursed." Determined to find him, Layla retraced her steps to the places they had spoken: the bridge, the alley, the old square where his music sometimes echoed. Finally, she found him in an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city. He was sitting on the floor, the violin in his lap. One of the strings was broken, and his hands trembled as he tried to repair it. "Ash," Layla said softly, stepping inside. He looked up, startled but not entirely surprised to see her. His shoulders slumped, and he let the broken string fall from his fingers. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "And you shouldn't be alone," Layla replied, kneeling beside him. Ash's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the violin in his lap. "You don't understand. This music, it's all I have. When it fails me, when I fail it..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Layla placed a hand on his arm. "You haven't failed anything. Music isn't perfect. It's alive, like you said. It breathes, it breaks, and it heals." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he looked at her. "Why do you care?" Layla hesitated, her heart pounding. "Because your music saved me. When I couldn't find my words, your violin gave me hope. I want to do the same for you." Ash's expression softened, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable. "I don't deserve it," he murmured. "You deserve more than you think," Layla said firmly. Chapter 4: Unveiling the Shadows. Over the next few weeks, Layla refused to let Ash retreat into his isolation. She brought him new strings for his violin, sat with him as he practiced, and even convinced him to play during the day. Slowly, he began to open up. "My real name is Sebastian," he confessed one afternoon as they walked along the river. "Ash was a nickname I gave myself when I came here." "Why change your name?" Layla asked. Sebastian hesitated, his gaze distant. "Because the man I was, he doesn't exist anymore." Bit by bit, Layla learned his story. He had been a renowned violinist in his youth, performing in grand concert halls across the continent. But an accident had left his left hand partially crippled, forcing him to relearn everything he once knew. Consumed by shame and self-doubt, he had fled to Mistervale, hoping to disappear. "You didn't disappear," Layla said gently. "You became something else, someone else. And your music, no matter how flawed you think it is, it's more beautiful than anything I've ever heard." Sebastian looked at her then, his eyes full of unspoken emotion. "You're the first person who's ever said that." Chapter 5: A Duet of Dreams. As the seasons turned, their bond deepened. Layla found her voice in poetry again, while Sebastian rediscovered his passion for music. They began collaborating, Layla writing verses inspired by his melodies, and Sebastian composing pieces that brought her words to life. One evening, Sebastian handed her a small notebook. "I've been working on something," he said, his tone uncharacteristically shy. Layla opened the notebook to find pages of handwritten music. At the top of the first page, he had written, "The Poet's Sonata." "It's for you," he said, "for everything you've given me." Layla's eyes filled with tears. "Sebastian, it's incredible." "I want us to play it together," he said, taking her hand. "Your words, my violin, a duet." The idea terrified Layla, but Sebastian's belief in her was unwavering. Together, they prepared for their debut, a small performance at the city's annual Festival of Lights. Chapter 6: The Light in the Dark. The night of the festival was clear and crisp, the stars shimmering above Mistervale like a scattering of diamonds. Layla stood backstage, her heart racing as the murmurs of the crowd filled her ears. Sebastian placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll do this together," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, drawing strength from his calm presence. When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. Sebastian lifted his violin, and the first notes of the poet's sonata filled the air. Layla's voice followed, her words weaving seamlessly with the music. Flowed together like waves on the shore, each rising and falling in perfect harmony. Layla's poetry painted vivid images of hope and resilience, while Sebastian's violin seemed to cry, laugh, and breathe with every note. As they reached the crescendo, the crowd held its collective breath. The final stanza of Layla's poem rang out clear and true, and Sebastian's bow stilled on the last haunting note. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the audience erupted into applause, cheers echoing through the square. Layla turned to Sebastian, her chest heaving from the intensity of the performance. His face was illuminated by the lanterns, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude. "You were brilliant," he whispered. "You too," she replied, her voice trembling. He took her hand, holding it tightly as they bowed together. Chapter 7: Love in Every Note. The performance marked a turning point for them both. Offers began pouring in for Sebastian to play at events, and Layla's poetry was requested for publication. but neither of them cared about fame. They cared about each other. They spent their days working side by side, creating new pieces and dreaming of the future. Layla often teased Sebastian about his seriousness, while he admired her ability to find beauty in the smallest moments. One rainy afternoon, as they sat by the fire in Layla's small apartment, Sebastian surprised her by pulling out a small box. "I was waiting for the right moment," he said, his voice steady but soft. Layla's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate silver ring adorned with a tiny engraving of a violin and quill intertwined. "You've shown me that even the most broken things can be beautiful," he said. "And that love isn't about being perfect. It's about growing together. I want to keep growing with you, Layla. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes, Sebastian. Always, yes." Chapter 8. A Legacy of Light. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the same chapel where Layla had found Sebastian repairing his violin. Friends and strangers alike gathered to celebrate, the sound of their laughter and music spilling into the streets of Mistra Vale. As the years passed, their love only deepened. They became known throughout the city as the poet and the violinist, their works inspiring countless others. Layla's poetry spoke of resilience and love, while Sebastian's music brought her words to life with breathtaking emotion. Together they opened a small school, teaching young musicians and writers to embrace imperfection and find their voices in the shadows. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the river, Layla rested her head on Sebastian's shoulder. "Do you think the shadows ever really leave us?" she asked. "No," Sebastian replied, his voice thoughtful. "But they don't have to define us. They're just part of the music." Layla smiled, lacing her fingers with his. "Then I'm glad we found ours together." As the sun set over Mistra Vale, their melodies and words echoed through the city, a testament to the beauty of love forged in the shadows. Chapter 9. The Longing Years. Layla and Sebastian's life together seemed charmed, but even the brightest melodies had their minor chords. As they began building their school for young artists, challenges arose. Mistra Vale's city council was reluctant to approve funding for a school dedicated to imperfect arts. "We can't waste resources on dreams," one council member sneered during a meeting. "What good is teaching broken musicians and poets who can't rhyme properly?" Sebastian clenched his fists under the table. Layla placed a calming hand on his arm and leaned forward. "Art is not about perfection," she said, her voice steady. "It's about connection. We've seen lives change because of music and words. Let us prove it." Reluctantly, the council granted them a single year to demonstrate the school's value. If they couldn't produce tangible results, the funding would be withdrawn. Determined, Layla and Sebastian threw themselves into their work. They traveled through Mistra Vale and beyond, finding students who had been overlooked or dismissed, an orphan boy with a gift for lyrics, a girl who could craft melodies from memory but never had formal training, and many more. Chapter 10. A New Song. The school opened in spring, its doors creaking on their makeshift hinges. Layla and Sebastian poured every ounce of energy into teaching. Sebastian taught the students not just how to play their instruments, but how to feel the music, to pour their emotions into every note. Layla guided her students to find their voices, encouraging them to embrace vulnerability in their writing. "Truth is messy," she told them, "but it's also beautiful. That's where art lives." The students thrived, their confidence growing with every lesson. By summer, the school was alive with music and laughter, yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. Sebastian's old injury, a dull ache in his hand, had begun to worsen. Some days, his fingers trembled so badly he couldn't hold his bow. He hid it from Layla, not wanting to burden her. But she noticed the strain in his eyes and the way he avoided playing for too long. "Sebastian," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "what's wrong?" "Nothing," he replied quickly, looking away. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Don't shut me out," he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's my hand. The pain's getting worse." Layla's heart ached for him. "We'll find a way through this," she said, "together." Chapter 11. Shadows of Doubt. As Sebastian struggled with his injury, Layla faced her own challenges. A renowned poet from the capital had come to Mystra Vale, offering to mentor her and publish her work in prestigious literary journals. It was an opportunity she dreamed of, but it would mean leaving Mystra Vale and Sebastian behind for months. "Take it," Sebastian said when she told him. "You've worked so hard for this." "But what about the school? And you?" "I'll manage," he said, forcing a smile. "You've given me so much, Layla. It's your turn to shine." Reluctantly, Layla accepted the offer. As she packed her bags, she felt a deep ache in her chest, as though she were leaving part of herself behind. Sebastian walked her to the station, his violin case slung over his shoulder. "You'll write to me? Every day," she promised. As the train pulled away, Layla pressed her hand to the window, watching Sebastian grow smaller and smaller until he disappeared from view. Chapter 12. Distance. The months apart were harder than either of them had anticipated. Layla threw herself into her work, earning accolades for her poetry. But in the quiet moments, she missed Sebastian fiercely. His letters were her lifeline, filled with stories of the school and the students they had nurtured together. Sebastian, meanwhile, struggled to keep the school running. His hand worsened, and he began delegating more of his teaching to advanced students. At night, he sat alone in the chapel, staring at his violin and wondering if he'd ever play the way he once had. One evening, a letter from Layla arrived. It was longer than usual, her handwriting hurried and uneven. "Sebastian, I miss you more than I can say. The city is exciting, but it's not home. You are my home. I'm coming back." Chapter 13. The Reunion. When Layla returned to Mystra Vale, she found Sebastian waiting for her at the train station. He looked thinner, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but his smile was as warm as ever. "You're here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm here," she whispered. Back at the school, Layla was amazed at how much it had grown. The students greeted her like family, their music and writing flourishing under Sebastian's guidance. But as she settled back into life in Mystra Vale, she noticed how often Sebastian avoided playing. One night, she found him in the chapel, staring at his violin. "Play for me," she said softly. He shook his head. "I can't, not the way I used to." "You don't have to be perfect," she said, kneeling beside him. "Just play." Slowly, hesitantly, Sebastian lifted the bow. The first notes were shaky, but as he continued, the music grew stronger. Layla closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. It wasn't the flawless precision of his younger years, but it carried a raw, aching beauty that spoke to everything they had endured. When he finished, Sebastian set the violin down with trembling hands. He looked at Layla, his expression a mix of vulnerability and hope. "It's not enough," he said. Layla cupped his face, her eyes shining. "It's more than enough. Your music has never been about perfection. It's about what it makes people feel, and it made me feel everything." Sebastian pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "You always know how to remind me of who I am." Chapter 14. The Forgotten Dream. Their reunion reignited their passion for the school and each other. Together, they organized a showcase for the city council, inviting the townspeople to see what their students had accomplished. The night of the showcase, the students performed a mix of music and poetry, blending their talents into a breathtaking display of creativity. Layla introduced the event with a poem she had written about Mystra Vale, a love letter to its shadows and light, its history and hope. When the final performance ended, the room erupted in applause. Even the council members were visibly moved, their earlier skepticism replaced with admiration. "You've proven us wrong," one of them admitted. "Your school is a gift to this city." But the night wasn't over. As the crowd began to disperse, one of the students, a shy boy named Thomas, approached Sebastian and Layla with an old, worn notebook. "This belonged to my grandfather," Thomas said. "He used to say that Mystra Vale was built on a forgotten symphony, a song that united the city centuries ago. I thought you might like to see it." Intrigued, Sebastian and Layla flipped through the pages. The notebook contained fragments of an unfinished symphony, its notes scattered like pieces of a puzzle. "Do you think it's real?" Layla asked. Sebastian's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "If it is, maybe we can finish it." Chapter 15. A Symphony of Shadows. The discovery of the forgotten symphony consumed them. Sebastian worked tirelessly to piece together the melodies, while Layla researched the history behind the music. They learned that the symphony had been written during a time of great division in Mystra Vale, meant to heal the city's fractured spirit. But before it could be performed, the composer had died, and the music had been lost to time. As they worked, Sebastian's hand continued to trouble him. There were days when the pain was so severe he couldn't hold his bow, forcing him to rely on Layla and their students to help. But instead of despairing, he leaned into their support, realizing that the symphony was bigger than any one person. Layla, too, found herself pushed beyond her limits. Writing lyrics for a centuries-old composition was daunting, but she poured her heart into every word. She wanted the symphony to honor not just the past, but the present, their journey, their struggles, and their love. Chapter 16, The Performance of a Lifetime. By winter, the symphony was complete. The performance was scheduled for the Festival of Lights, the same event where Layla and Sebastian had debuted their first collaboration years ago. The night of the performance, the city square was packed. Lanterns illuminated the stage, casting a warm glow over the musicians and singers. Layla stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she introduced the piece. "This symphony was born in shadows," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But it's a testament to the light we find when we come together." Sebastian conducted the orchestra, his movements deliberate and graceful despite his injury. As the music swelled, Layla's voice joined the melody, her lyrics weaving through the notes like a thread of gold. The symphony was a triumph. The final crescendo brought the audience to their feet, their applause thunderous and unending. Chapter 17, Ever After. The symphony cemented their legacy in Mystra Vale. The city embraced the school as a cornerstone of its culture, and students came from far and wide to learn from the poet and the violinist. Layla and Sebastian continued to create together, their love growing stronger with every challenge they faced. Though Sebastian's hand never fully healed, he found new ways to express himself through music, mentoring others and composing pieces that touched the soul. Years later, as they sat together on a balcony overlooking the city, Layla turned to Sebastian and smiled. "Do you think we'll ever run out of stories to tell?" she asked. Sebastian took her hand, his eyes filled with warmth. "Not as long as we have each other." And so their melody played on, a song of shadows, light, and unbreakable love.